We are back. This morning we heard quite a lot about China-US rivalry. We heard about geopolitics and the potential impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And we heard about climate change and how it fits in. So we're very lucky today to have Randy MacEwen, who is the CEO of Ballard, who will talk to Ballard Power, which is a hydrogen company that produces and sells in China. And do you produce and sell in Germany, or Germany's just...
We're selling into Germany, but not producing yet.
Okay. But Germany is your second largest market, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you've got, Germany is their second largest market. So you've got a company on the cusp of the energy transition, using technologies that are going to be critical to the energy transition, operating in a complicated geopolitical environment. And so I think we couldn't be more lucky than to have Randy with us today to discuss these issues and others.
Yeah, it's a really great pleasure to have you here to have a conversation with us. So could you just tell us a bit about yourself, your current job, and your background?
Yeah, my background is really unremarkable, so I can be pretty brief on that. So I actually started out practicing corporate law, doing mergers and acquisitions and corporate finance. And for about 6 years doing mergers and acquisitions and corporate finance, one of the clients I had was in the hydrogen and fuel cell industry. And so this is now 20 plus years ago where I got introduced to the energy transition. It's really fascinating to think about the drivers, the macro drivers at that time are very durable and actually exist today. So we always talked, this is back in the 1995 to 1997 timeframe when I first started getting introduced to the energy transition. We always talked about the triple threat of energy security, climate change, and air quality. And so I chose to move out of the practice of law and move into a company that was in clean technology. And I've been in clean technology ever since. And so I worked in Toronto for many years. And then I moved down to California and joined a solar company for about a decade. And about 8 years ago, moved back to Canada, became the CEO of Ballard at that time. And really, Ballard designs and manufactures fuel cell engines for the medium and heavy duty motive applications of bus, truck, rail, and marine. And I just want to spend a minute on this so that people understand, I think, an important distinction in how you electrify mobility. And so there's two different technology approaches that are highly complementary. Where you have light vehicles that have short range requirements, low daily utilization, and maybe lots of time to recharge, battery electrification is very compelling. And by contrast, where you have heavy vehicles that have high daily range requirements, high utilization requirements, and a need for fast refueling, hydrogen fuel cell technology is very compelling. So we see both these technologies as highly complementary. And so we've been at Ballard designing and manufacturing fuel cell engines for these medium and heavy duty motive applications. The company's 43 years old, been publicly listed on NASDAQ and the Toronto Stock Exchange for over 25 years. But notwithstanding that long history, it's just starting to happen today. And that's because, as you point out, we sit at the intersection of these converging macro trends of energy security, of climate change and the need to address this climate crisis, as well as electrification and technology disruption. So we sit with this disruptive fuel cell technology with the ability to help decarbonize mobility applications that to date have been very difficult to abate. I just want to highlight two other key points about why we focus on these medium and heavy duty motive applications. So, obviously we're trying to decarbonize these applications. It's important to understand these applications disproportionately contribute to emissions. So think about buses and commercial trucks that are only 10% of all on-road vehicles in North America, yet disproportionately contribute a third in a whopping of GHG emissions and a whopping 2/3 of NOx and PM 2.5. So we're addressing these mobility applications that disproportionately contribute to emissions. And the second thing I want to highlight is that a number of these use cases in bus, truck, rail, and marine have the ability to come back to a base at night, come back to a yard and refuel. They currently come back to a yard and diesel refuel. So the ability to have applications where you come back to a yard and now hydrogen refuel and use that hydrogen on board a vehicle in a fuel cell technology to convert and effectively generate power and move that vehicle, you're taking those applications where they have the highest value proposition, but the lowest barrier to entry on the refueling side, because you don't need to have a distributed refueling infrastructure like you need for passenger cars. And the last thing I want to comment, and before we go to the next question, is really thinking about where are we today in hydrogen fuel cell adoption, because I think the audience may not be familiar with this. It is still very early stages, the first second of a 24-hour day in terms of market adoption. But today, there are 50,000 fuel cell forklifts operating at Amazon and Walmart and Home Depot in the US with hydrogen fuel cell technology. Today, there are about 50,000 passenger cars. I drove one for 2 years, a Hyundai fuel cell car, that are on roads globally. And today, there are about 7,000 buses and commercial trucks operating on roads, most of them in China, and probably about in Europe and North America, probably about 85–90% of those buses and trucks have Ballard technology inside, and in China, about 50%. So we have very high market share globally in this early market adoption. So just want to highlight some of those data points. You can have an understanding that the adoption that I just profiled early, but just 3-5 years ago, those numbers would have been 0, 0, 0. So we've seen a lot of growth over the last number of years. And of course, we'll see significant growth over the coming 10-20 years.
IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, estimates that hydrogen technologies could account for up to 12% of final energy consumption by 2050. Mm-hmm. Do you agree with that? Is that sort of the ballpark that you work on, or do you think it's an over or underestimate? Yeah, so I actually think there are 2 data points or 2 targets that globally, whether it's IRENA or the Hydrogen Council, the IEA, are looking at these targets for 2030 and 2050. And for 2050, I do believe you're going to see 10–15% of the entire energy mix will be hydrogen. And I want to be clear about this. If you look at some of the global policies today, you have 93 countries that have net zero carbon targets by 2050. 93 countries. You have 55 countries that have CO2 pricing initiatives today. And now 50 countries globally have hydrogen strategies. 50 countries. That represents about 90% as well of GDP, global GDP. Now, if you back up a few years ago, these hydrogen strategies weren't in place. So we now have these 50 countries with hydrogen strategies and roadmaps because there's a recognition that the only way to achieve a 1.5 degrees scenario by 2050 is that hydrogen must be a key part of this energy transition. You cannot achieve it but for the use of hydrogen. And hydrogen is also frequently referred to as kind of the Swiss Army knife of energy transition because you have multiple uses and applications, a lot of flexibility on what hydrogen can decarbonize. So energy, industry like steel and cement, and of course mobility that I talked about as well. So I believe hydrogen will be a significant part of the energy mix. You can debate whether it's 15–20% in 2050. I think the more interesting statistics or forecasts are what will they be in 2030. In my mind, we can't achieve our 2050 objectives on CO2 reduction unless we focus on 2030. And the beauty about 2030 is that it's far enough away that we have time to take action,
but it's close enough that we must take action now. And so that's just starting.
Right. So you mentioned that hydrogen, especially green hydrogen, can play a key role in the energy transition. So my question is, what may keep us from realizing that goal? So what may be the key? In other words, what may be the key that can facilitate hydrogen playing a key role in the energy transition?
Right. I think there's a couple things that won't be an inhibitor. So one in my mind will be technology. I think we have a lot of the technologies we need today in order to achieve hydrogen adoption at scale. So you mentioned green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is when you take wind or solar or other renewables and you split water using electrolysis into water's constituent components, hydrogen and oxygen. That you then use that hydrogen for a variety of applications, including mobility that I just referenced. So we have electrolysis technology today. Then the use of that hydrogen in an application with fuel cells. We have fuel cell technology today. The technologies are proven to be safe, reliable, durable. What we don't have yet today is low-cost electrolysis and low-cost fuel cell technology because we are in those initial stages of adoption. Now, I was in the solar industry for a decade. And if you saw what happened in wind and solar, even in the battery industry, costs have come down in wind and solar 85+% over the last 15 years. I think you'll see the same thing occur with electrolysis technology and with fuel cell technology between now and 2030, with the cost of these technologies coming down 70% between now and 2030 as you scale up. Now, we need to have that scaling, the supply and demand match, like we had in solar and wind and now in batteries, to drive these costs down. So I don't believe it'll be technology challenge or cost challenge. To me, the big challenge is, will we have the right political policy, the right policies to spur and support adoption, and particularly early adopters, so that we can get the volume we need as an industry to bring costs down. And once we do that, I also think, by the way, it's critically important that capital, finance, has the ability to have solutions that are bankable with an ownership cost structure, total cost of ownership cost structure, a use case economics that makes sense. So in my mind, the key role we need is for government to put in place policy that can support adoption. And the same type of policy levers that were used in solar and wind and the adoption of battery electric technology can be used in the hydrogen and fuel cell industry.
So you mentioned that 50 countries or something like that had hydrogen strategy policies at the government level.
Yes.
So are you saying those are insufficient, or governments have to act more? What are those strategies? What do they look like?
Good question. So those are macro strategies identifying hydrogen as an energy carrier that will help to decarbonize industry, energy, and mobility. And also critically important is there's an understanding, of course, that renewables must be a big part of the solution, and renewables are growing significantly. But renewables are intermittent. And so you have wind and solar now becoming significant portions of different grid mixes. You need to have the ability to firm and stabilize that power production. Hydrogen offers the opportunity to be a storage medium and effectively store energy, whether it's renewables, for hours, for days, for months, for seasons, which is very unique. Batteries don't have that capability. And so there's a very key role that hydrogen will play as a storage medium as well. So all these policies are recognizing the role of hydrogen to support broad-scale adoption of renewables and to decarbonize these hard-to-abate sectors. But those policies and roadmaps haven't yet translated to subsidies and incentives and tax credits that will support the adoption and enable early adopters to have a value proposition commensurate with legacy technology so that they're not adopting at a disadvantage. And that's exactly what happened in solar and wind. where you had feed-in tariffs or you had tax credits that helped those early adopters. And as the volume goes up and the costs come down, then the policy subsidies support levers fade away.
Both you and Danny have discussed a bit about Ballard. Can you give us a little bit more information about your products and maybe explain to us what the fuel cells are and also your geographic scope and your innovation and in what ways Ballard is contributing to the innovation required for more use of hydrogen and in the energy transition?
Yeah, so I see the very key role, and we're a small company, we have 1,200 employees, but every single employee is fired up every day for the opportunity to go and help decarbonize mobility and pass on to the next generation a more sustainable planet. So that's really our focus, is how can we address these markets of bus, truck, rail, and marine. Now, geographically, we're focused on 3 key regions: China, Europe, and I used to say California. Increasingly, I'm going to say North America, but if you look at where our install base and where there's been strong support and where the customers are and market, I'm going to say pull. It's been a long time before we got to market pull, but China, Europe, and California are the 3 key markets that we've been focusing on geographically. And I think I just want to highlight the business model that we have that might be interesting for people is, the fact we're selling the same core technology, the same fuel cell products, in some cases with some changes to the bill of materials and derivative products, into different markets, buses, trucks, rail, marine applications, means we have a lot of leverage. So multiple shots on goal with our technology. So we see this business model 5, 10, 15 years from now having a lot of resiliency with a lot of diversification, where the bus market will be the first market adopting fuel cell technology. It grows. The truck market on top of that, which is a very large market, over $100 billion a year for the sale of engines into the truck market. 47% of that, by the way, in China. Then as those 2 markets grow, you add the rail market. As those 3 markets grow, you add the marine market. So we end up with this revenue stacking or scaffolding effect across multiple market applications with different regions, with different customers, and a very diverse business model that we think is very attractive. So a lot of leverage, because a lot of people say you're selling into the bus market, you're selling into the truck, rail, marine markets. It doesn't sound very focused, but it's this business model of using the same core technology in multiple market applications. And maybe I just might comment on a couple of customers as well. So in the rail market, CRRC, which is the largest manufacturer of trains or rolling stock in the world, the big player for trains in China, they have 5 trains operating in Guangdong province since December of 2019 with our fuel cell engines inside, generating beautiful data in terms of reliability and durability, etc. We're working with Siemens, who just a couple of days ago launched their hydrogen and fuel cell train. We've been developing a fuel cell engine for them for 3.5 years. And here in Canada with CP Rail, who's looking at this transition from diesel locomotives for the transport of goods to hydrogen locomotives. And we see this theme playing out over the next 20 years. So in the marine market, we're working with ABB and some of the largest manufacturers of marine vessels, particularly in Europe. Europe's a very strong market for marine. So I just want to highlight that business model and the diversification and resiliency and the revenue stacking long term.
So you mentioned that the first market you mentioned was China. If I look, if my data are correct, I think about over 50% of your revenues originate in China.
Yes.
Does this make you nervous?
It makes me, as I think about our model, we've said for a couple of years, we want to have about 40% of our revenue from China, 40% of our revenue from Europe, and 20% of our revenue from rest of world, primarily California. The way it's turning out right now is that this year, we'll actually probably have about 60% of our revenue from Europe. So Europe is really gaining a lot of momentum, not surprisingly, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have this market environment where energy security has catapulted and reshuffled the cards, where energy security is now the primary driver rather than the climate crisis. Of course, they're both aligned and both support for us market adoption. But I think one thing important to understand, and everyone knows this about China, it is an enormous market. Let me just, I mentioned, 47, 48% of all new trucks sold globally are sold into China each year. You look at the bus market. North America, every year there's 5,100 new buses in North America. In Europe, 13 to 15,000 buses per year. In China, depending on which report you believe, it's somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 buses per year. So the size of the market cannot be ignored. And then you have China with very strong policy to adopt hydrogen. And there's a few, I think, geopolitical reasons behind this. It's not just about climate change, but it's also about how does China reduce its dependence on imported energy, and particularly imported energy that's being transported by shipping routes that can be easily blockaded. And so China sees this opportunity to grow their renewable energy base, wind and solar, which is, some of the, basically solar is dominated by the Chinese manufacturing companies now. Wind has a number of strong turbine manufacturers, but they're developing and growing renewable energy projects in China at a significant pace. And so this ability to not only green their grids and reduce GHG emissions, but also reduce dependence on imported energy. We've got China in the last year saying no more coal from Australia. And of course, just a number of months ago, we had an energy crisis in China where a number of provinces had to slow down production in their provinces given energy demand and supply challenges. So, I think that's a key reason that China is looking at hydrogen. And I think if you look at the policies in China, they plan to adopt 1 million fuel cell vehicles by 2030. No other country has that type of aggressive target on the adoption of fuel cell vehicles published. And when they say fuel cell vehicles, they're not talking about passenger cars, they're talking about trucks and buses, the markets that we're addressing. So China is a very large market, and we see as well that the supply chain, not unlike other industries, is very robust. So the opportunity for us to procure and source materials and components, not just for the domestic China market, but for the global market is very important. Now, of course, we all have, in all industries, these themes now of deglobalization and the importance of looking at onshoring as well, the importance of having supply chains in all your key markets. So that's a theme that we're looking at. But we view China as the most important market for our success and our growth, not just in the next 10 years, but probably the next 50 years.
Right. China is not only important market for Ballard sales, but also important production place for Ballard's products. And we noticed that Ballard has a few joint ventures in China. And we know an important concern many executives have about having joint ventures in China is about how to protect your technologies. Mm-hmm. Can you share some experiences Ballard had in China? Yeah,
so maybe as some context, the most important joint venture we have in China is in Shandong province with a very large SOE called Weichai Power. Weichai Power is the largest manufacturer of diesel engines globally. Think of them as the Cummins of China, if you will. So we have a joint venture, 51% owned by Weichai and 49% owned by Ballard, with all the usual shareholder arrangements and provisions that make sure effectively there's equal decision-making conceptually. And then, I think what's important to understand is that as we looked at that China market and localizing there, we thought it was very important to be with a partner in China that has scale, that has supply chain muscle, has manufacturing experience in high volume, which we don't have at Ballard, candidly, but also has international assets and cares about their reputation, cares about their brand, thinks about IP issues, in my opinion, thoughtfully. And I've seen this play out. We signed up a joint venture agreement in 2018, so we're 4 years into this. So we've built out the largest manufacturing facility in the world for fuel cell engines for buses and commercial trucks with Weichai in this joint venture. So it can produce 20,000 fuel cell engines annually today. So think about that, servicing 20,000 trucks. Now, you're right. I think probably the most important concern our investors, our board, our employees, even some other customers and partners had is, what about your IP? What about your technology? And I think it's important to understand, I believe there's been a long-standing policy in China that there's effectively a trade. You get market access, you bring technology. So that's the way we went into this, thinking about it, first of all, conceptually. So we said, how do we protect our technology? So I'd say there are 4 key things that we did. And we spent a lot of time with other companies, multinational enterprises, looking at their experience in the China market. And so number 1 is, in some places we said, we're going to move technology into China. Let's accept that, but let's get paid for it. So we said, okay, this scope of work, we're comfortable moving into China, so the manufacturing of our fuel cell engines. And we have a $90 million technology transfer agreement with our Weichai-Ballard joint venture. So we're getting paid for that technology transfer. And I think it's always very important, in my opinion as well, to make sure you get paid up front and there's no capital risk. So that's important, is you get paid for the technology transfer. Number 2 is pick your partners carefully. And I mentioned all of our consideration of Weichai. I actually went and visited a number of companies that Weichai had invested in internationally. Companies in Germany, in Italy, in France. Met and talked to these companies about their experience working with Weichai. And so we believe we have a counterparty that does care about their international reputation. And I've seen it play out, how they take their own actions in their own business to protect their IP, and how that's translated to our joint venture. So picking your partners and the commercial arrangements you have with those partners is very critical. I won't go into detail, but how you structure those arrangements is critical. The third one is to stay ahead of next generation technology with your own R&D investments at home. And so, I would say what we do in China is a half a generation, probably not a full generation behind what we're doing here in Vancouver. So that's important. And then the last thing I would say is to make your arrangements in the market performance-based, and the ability to withdraw, whether it's a license or some type of contractual arrangements, if you don't get the performance you're looking for. Now, people say, well, your IP is already out the door, it's too late, but it does give you some levers. So those are the things we look at. And of course, as we set up facilities in China, we go through a process with advisors and consultants in the China market about how to think about security of your facilities, how to think about access, how to think about your IT infrastructure. So there's a significant investment you need to make sure you're de-risking as much as you can this obvious risk.
Interesting. So, what was I going to ask about that? Following up. Oh, yeah. So, do you have any evidence of IP spillover? Have competitors started to arise in China that are in your space?
Yeah, the area that's been a bit of a challenge is where we've had, in some cases, some China national employees that worked for our company for a long time here in Vancouver that got recruited away from our company at very lucrative contracts to the China market. Mm-hmm. And so they spent 20 years with our company learning about our technology and have brought that knowledge to the China market, in some cases in new entrepreneurial startups that are competing directly with us. So that's been a challenge. We've got to pick our spots on when we want to be aggressive in pursuing that type of behavior.
Maybe last question before we have the Q&A.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Maybe you just tell us in general how Ballard and its board consider geopolitical risks, because we've been talking about this the whole morning.
So, this is a timely question. We just had a very interesting board discussion. We're looking at additional manufacturing expansion in China right now. We've been in negotiation with the Shanghai government for about a year on this. And of course, it's a very challenging time right now in Shanghai. At the same time, we see this growth occurring in Europe. So we are in the process of assessing a very sizable investment for our company, over $100 million in the China market, while also seeing that Europe is making a very strong pivot on this energy transition, energy security, future. And so, understandably, an interesting question from our board, is now the right time? And a key question was, what's China's reaction been to the Russian invasion in Ukraine? And what type of perception to that reaction are we seeing in social media? Are we seeing from politicians and policymakers and other companies? Is that another issue we need to address before we make yet another deepened investment in the China market? We spent a couple of hours with experts on the China market and experts on the geopolitics of energy discussing these issues. And so very timely. And so we go through a very thoughtful discussion, very open discussion about the risks, how you mitigate those risks. And you make, the best informed decision you can make. One of the things that I think is important is a number of companies will look at some of these issues and say, well, why don't we just wait? And in my opinion, business, industries, policy is changing so fast, a wait and see strategy is not an appropriate strategy, at least for us. And so we are making decisions and we'll make investments. If we get them wrong, we'll have to find ways to backtrack and to mitigate them. But we're going to make a decision. So I think that's important to understand. But geopolitics, I would say, the 8 years I've been at Ballard as CEO of the company, the geopolitical discussion has never been so heightened as it is at this very moment at the board level and at the executive table.
Great. Well, I can see a lineup of questions. Thank you, by the way, Randy. That was... I can tell from the lineup of questions that you struck a few nerves. So I think, yes, you had your hand up first.
Well, I want to thank you for a very, very interesting sharing with us this discussion. I just got into researching on fuel cell technology because in a paper that I'm writing with a colleague on the automotive market in China, the question was, what is the second technology beyond lithium batteries? So my recollection is when I was living in Hangzhou not 2 years ago, there were 3 bus lines in Hangzhou that were already all electric, and they do one round, then they get charged before they enter the cycle again and again and again. And I think the same company also sold electric buses to London, that all the buses in London are on these electric buses. So where's my question? My question is, are we seeing an obsoleting the lithium batteries to be replaced by fuel cell technology? And when do you think how many years is it before it's going to flip?
Yeah. So a couple of important issues, I think, to bring out. One is you have a very complicated supply chain for batteries. So you have lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt. Some of them are very concentrated in regions of very challenged geopolitical context. And so I think you have that. And then you have also then the processing of those rare earth metals. A lot of the processing is done in China. So I think China, but also globally, a number of countries are questioning the sustainability of the supply chain and the geopolitical risks of that supply chain for batteries. So that's number one. Number two is also you need to think about the GHG intensity of the supply chain as well. So as you're extracting and mining and processing materials, that comes with some CO2 emissions as well. And you need to look at things, comparative technologies, from a cradle to grave, or as I like to refer to it at our company, a cradle to cradle type of approach, because we have a lot of recyclability and reusability for our technology. So I think these are other issues that governments and business are now starting to think about, kind of the top of top of an iceberg, above the surface, we've been talking about, the comparative benefits of different technologies, including range and weight and recharge or refuel time. But below the surface, we've got these other fundamental issues that need to be addressed. I don't view hydrogen fuel cell technology as displacing battery electric buses. I view them as working together. And what I see is a number of transit operators that will have both technologies. Where you have short ranges, they'll have battery electric buses. Where you have longer, daily routes, they're going to need fuel cell technology. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In California today, there is a mandate that 100% of all new transit buses must be zero emission, not low emission, but zero emission by 2029. 50% of all new transit buses must be zero emission by 2025. So now all the transit operators in California have had to publish reports on how do they get to their zero emission of new transit buses by 2029. A number of them have concluded, we've done studies with fuel cell buses and battery electric buses. Some of them have concluded we have short routes and we have the ability for recharging infrastructure, so maybe we think battery electrics will work. Others have concluded we don't have recharging infrastructure capabilities and we have long routes and we're going to go fuel cell buses. So for example, AC Transit in Oakland said they're going 70% fuel cell buses, 30% battery electric. Sunline in Palm Desert, 90% fuel cells, 10% battery electric. So I could give you some other examples as well. The same thing is happening in Europe. So you mentioned London. So we've had a cluster of fuel cell buses operating in London for over 8 years to prove the durability of the product. So that's now proven. We're the only company in the world that's proven 40,000 hours of durability in the field, not a PowerPoint presentation or an idea or a test, but in the field. And so I think this, you're going to see a number of cities in China that will have both battery electric and fuel cell electric buses. Many of them have invested in battery electric buses, and many of them have experienced the challenges and the limitations of battery technology where you have long routes and where you need fast refueling. But I think the more interesting market, quite frankly, is the truck market. In the long transport truck market, if you want to use battery technology to get the range you require, you need to displace a third of the payload, a third of the cargo, and displace that with batteries, the weight of batteries, in order to satisfy your range requirements. So there's a massive technology disadvantage, in my opinion, for battery electric as you get to heavy vehicles with long range. And I'll just add to that, there's also a number of off-road markets. So think about mining haul trucks or construction equipment that are extremely heavy, where batteries will not be able to satisfy the use case. So I think you're going to see both technologies being used in the use cases that make sense and where the value proposition economics play out. But I do think the supply chain and the GHG intensity and even recyclability at end of life are all important considerations that need to be discussed over the coming months and years.
Lourdes.
The war in Ukraine, it seems that instead of accelerating the energy transition, governments are investing, yet again, the old economy, in oil and, God forbid, even coal, given the situation that is happening mainly in Germany and Hungary and in other places. How do you see that? It's a little bit like the last question of Jing was on this sense, and you seemed optimistic. Do you see an acceleration towards green energies or a reverse and saying, the old economy needs, we still need a lot of oil and gas, etc.?
Yeah, I do think there are a number of markets like Canada that produce oil and gas that will be looking for opportunities to export to Europe. That being said, what was fascinating to me was post-Russian invasion of Ukraine is how quickly you had this galvanized response globally, but also in Europe, very quickly you had the EU come out with what's called Repower EU. And Repower EU is a policy that effectively says we were planning to adopt green hydrogen in scale at 2030. That plan is now 4 to 5x that original plan. We must accelerate. And just two days ago, there was a significant announcement with about 100 companies and the EU announcing their adoption of electrolysis technology to support green hydrogen production and associated renewables and acceleration of permitting for renewable technologies and acceleration of permitting for electrolysis technology. So I am 100%, I have a high conviction that we're going to see adoption of renewables and hydrogen. I do think you're going to see countries that have natural gas looking for the opportunity to produce what's called blue hydrogen, which is where you reform natural gas into hydrogen and you have carbon capture and sequestration to reduce the GHG emissions. So I think you'll see both pathways, but I'm 100% convinced we're going to see large-scale adoption of renewables continue to grow and accelerate, and that the recent events are a catalyst for that.
Almost the question I was about to ask, where do you get your hydrogen from? Because hydrogen, you connected hydrogen with decarbonization, which makes sense, or is the case. If you generate a hydrogen from solar and wind that can't be otherwise used at particular location because of fluctuation and so on, so it's a substitute for battery. But if you generate hydrogen by using fossil fuels, you're not really doing much about decarbonization. So given the ambitious targets that you set yourself on how much of energy usage should be through hydrogen, how are you going to generate that hydrogen other than using fossil fuels and thereby just shift the air pollution from one location somewhere else up the value chain?
Yeah, so I mean, the same argument can be made with battery electric, of course. If you don't have a tailpipe emissions, that's great. But if you're recharging from a grid that's 85% coal, you're not achieving any objective, right? So your production of hydrogen and the CO2 intensity of that hydrogen is critically important. So there are a number of great studies that have been done. I can refer you to the Hydrogen Council website that shows you the CO2 intensity of a number of different ways to produce hydrogen. But clearly, the most favorable is when you're using renewables, as we refer to that green hydrogen. And so we have these plans, and I think you'll see in excess of 150 gigawatts between now and 2030, gigawatts of projects where you have green hydrogen production. So this is going to be I think a significant build out of both renewables plus green hydrogen production between now and 2030 and a number of waypoints along the way. So we'll have a significant part of the hydrogen supply coming from renewables. And of course, that's best played out where you have what I'll call stranded or curtailed renewables. The wind is blowing, but there's no demand for that power at that time. That's an ideal time to capture those renewables and make hydrogen. But I do think you're going to see natural gas reformed hydrogen with carbon capture sequestration that will reduce the GHG emissions. And I think that'll play a significant part between now and 2030, 2040. But I view that very much as a transitory approach. And longer term, we're going to see high levels of penetration into our grids of renewables. I think we have some grids where you've got 30, 35% today. I think you'll see grids 70, 80% renewable in the future. And the only way, in my opinion, to achieve that is by using hydrogen as a storage medium.
I think we have time for one last question.
One criticism of batteries is that they are heavy. Correct me if I'm wrong, one criticism of hydrogen is that it's not very dense in terms of energy density. You require much more space in a car to basically store the energy in comparison to what we have now. How do you compensate for this? How do we address this? That's one thing. The other thing is that something I don't think we have discussed is the potential use of nuclear. It is non-carbon. It does have some very negative effects later on, but if we really want to accelerate transition, that's the energy that we could use. What's your view on this?
Yeah, I thought the same thing when I heard the question about the old economy, because just in the last month or so, I've heard a lot of people putting nuclear back on the table. kind of 20 megawatt micronuclear, I guess, small reactors. But that will take some time, right? So I know, for example, you've got TC Energy, a big company in Canada. They own 50% of Bruce, in Ontario, which is a nuclear generating facility. They're looking at expansion of that. And it's 2029 when that type of resource will come online. So nuclear will take a long time to see that build up. But I think you're going to see a number of countries revisiting nuclear for sure. And then just the first question on hydrogen. Yes, you're right. Batteries are very heavy, and that's a significant challenge with batteries. They also have energy density challenges as well. And so the challenge with hydrogen is to compress it or put it in a liquid form or some type of other medium so that you can have higher energy storage. But I just want to give you an example. So I had a hydrogen fuel cell car for 2 years, and that car had a range of about 430 kilometers. So very comparable to an internal combustion engine vehicle. It had 3 tanks that were underneath the seats and the infrastructure of the car without encroaching any storage space in the trunk. So I would probably argue, until the battery electric car I have right now, I would probably argue that was the best car I ever had. So, from a storage perspective, that's 700 bar or 10,000 PSI tanks that are proven out in terms of reliability as a technology. So I do think there are other ways to store hydrogen so that you get more energy density. Now I talk about CP Rail looking at locomotives where you've got long lines across the country, heavy loads, and the ability to have enough hydrogen to get those trains to where they need to go. And what I see is, again, an opportunity where you have 5, 6 strategically located refueling centers across the country that can accommodate the range you're looking for and the refueling infrastructure you need for. Or you can also look at, they already have 100, let's call it 100 intermodal units on these large freight locomotives behind them. You could add a fuel tender behind the locomotive as well to enable you to have, effectively range for 1,000 kilometers easily per day.
So
Yep.
we're right on time.
On time, on.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you very much.
give it a present.